Where did the U.S. national debt come from? And isn't it really the fault of political party that I don't like? No, it's a bipartisan failure. The reason why we have the debt that we do, the fiscal situation that we do, and how we went from in 2001 being on track to pay off our national debt to now in 2025 having debt as a share of GDP of 120%. So I'm going to talk through how we got there and then where we are now and how it could affect the economy going forward. The best explanation that I've seen comes from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank here in DC that advocates for basically better fiscal decision making by Congress, which they wrote this paper that came out last year called From Riches to Rags, Causes of Fiscal Deterioration Since 2001. One of the reasons why they picked 2001 is that in that year, the U.S. was in budget surplus, which might sound unfamiliar because we're so often in budget deficits. But we were in budget surplus, meaning that we collected more in taxes than we spent in any given year, and that surplus was then used to pay down the debt. And what CBO projected, just based on the current trajectory of taxing, spending, and surplus, that by 2009, we wouldn't have a national debt anymore. We were poised to pay it off completely. So how did we go from we are within spitting distance of completely paying off our debt to now it is the largest it has ever been, even when the economy is strong and our deficits run at around $2 trillion a year? Well, the report goes through it and basically itemizes each major legislation into taxing, spending, and emergency response to recessions to apportion out the debt increase. So what does that actually mean? So if you take the increase in debt, where it starts here in 2001 and it ends here in 2025, and you were to split it up into like 100% and say which percent is due to what, 28% comes from recession response. When the economy goes south, Congress has to kick into spending money to make sure that the economy doesn't deteriorate further, doesn't accelerate into some kind of depression or even worse recession. And it does so at a time when their own tax receipts go down because businesses aren't hiring, people are getting laid off, wages and income aren't growing. And so it's just kind of a necessary part of federal budgets that you're going to take a hit in recessions. The next largest chunk is spending. 33% comes from spending increases. The largest chunk, 37%, comes from tax cuts. Now, what the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is very clear to point out is that the vast majority of legislation, like each recession bill, each tax bill, each spending bill, the vast majority of that legislation was all bipartisan. And I know that we all want to blame somebody else, but truly this was a bipartisan failure, that in every successive Congress, they have pushed up the debt and not done much to strengthen our fiscal position. So what are these taxes, spending, and recession response? Now, the tax side I've talked about before. We've had tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. And kind of like a backstory, if you were alive back then, you would know that this was a Bush campaign promise. In the 2000 Bush versus Gore election, one of the big fights was, what do we do with the budget surplus? And Bush said he wanted to spend it on a tax cut, give it back to Americans, and that's exactly what he did twice over in 2001 and 2003. Those cuts were going to expire, so there was some kind of like minor continuation of them in 2009 and 2010, but they were made fully permanent in 2012. And then not even 5 years later in 2017, there was another tax cut. And those 2001, 2003, 2012, 2017, that's $7 trillion right there. And so that's where about the 37% of the increase comes from. It comes from these really large tax cuts. The 33% that comes from spending, a lot of it is expansions to Medicare and changes in Medicare program rules that alter how much Medicare spends in a year. So, in the early 2000s, we actually created a new part of Medicare, Medicare Part D, which has only grown kind of in incredible numbers since we've passed it. And then keep in mind, it's so easy to put things in the rear view and forget that they're there. But between 2001 and 2021, we were fighting a war in Afghanistan. And from 2003 to 2011, we were fighting a war in Iraq. And both of these conflicts are estimated to have cost somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion a piece. And a lot of the 33% of the debt that comes from spending A lot of that is spending on wars. Not all of it, but a lot of it came from spending on wars, which are not part of the kind of spending equation anymore. Of course, big pieces of legislation that have increased spending recently were under the Biden administration: the CHIPS bill, the energy bill, and the infrastructure bill. I do feel I do feel bad for Biden because we tend to blame the entire problem on whoever last contributed to it. So actually, it's all his fault, I'm sure. But that is where the debt comes from. It's mainly bipartisan legislation. It's, some of it, I would say the 28% that's recessions. I mean, that's pretty forgivable. We want the government to go into a debt to keep the economy stable. But yeah, 33% spending and 37% tax cuts. And frankly, as an economist, I would say we don't have a lot to show for either of those things. It's not like poverty has gone away with debt at 120% of GDP. It's not like we don't have child poverty anymore, or that every kid gets, three square meals a day, no matter what in this country. I mean, we've taken on a lot of debt, and we can't necessarily say that the U.S. economy has transformed since 2001 into an unrecognizable, glowing picture of strength. And in fact, a lot of people will tell you that they're no better off despite all the machinations from the federal government and, the decreasing stability of its finances. That is the worst performance measure by far. I mean, the whole notion of taking on debt is it allows you to make investments to grow the economy. And it's not clear that we've made those investments. And at least from a social policy side, I would say we haven't. Well, the debt is coming up today of this, really not good position of $2 trillion deficits, just under $2 trillion, I think it's like 1.9. Because Republicans in the House and Senate are trying to pass a $4 trillion tax cut, another tax cut following the $7 trillion that they've already passed previously, or that both parties have really passed previously. And they're going to pay for it with $1 trillion in spending cuts mainly to Medicaid and food stamps. They're going to kick around 10 million people off of Medicaid over a decade, which is 1 in 8 of the current beneficiaries. But they're going to borrow another $3 trillion. They're going to add another $3 trillion to the national debt. And credit rating agencies, which are private companies that assess the soundness and safeness of investments, have downgraded U.S. credit. And in fact, one of them did it just this week as the tax bill was being discussed as a warning to say, do not pass this tax bill because the U.S. is not in a fiscal position to do so. You need to get your house in order. And what they pointed out in their downgrading and kind of the pernicious aspect of the U.S. debt, as long as people are willing to buy U.S. debt, they're buying U.S. bonds, it doesn't necessarily affect the economy in a negative way. But two things will happen the more debt we have. One, the more debt we have, the more interest we have to pay on it. So if I lend the government $100 on a 5-year bond, they do have to pay interest on the debt that they owe, just like you have to pay interest on the debt you owe. Well, what Moody's pointed out in the downgrade was that a third of federal spending within 10 years will go to paying down the debt, on interest payments on the debt. A third of all of our spending will just be interest on the debt. That absolutely limits what we're able to do and the kind of maneuverability we're able to have through things like recession if a third of our hands are completely tied to debt payments. So that's problem one. The second problem with a large debt is that it makes the debt that we need, like the rest of the debt, becomes harder to sell. Right? Like it's one thing if we were selling debt at a 1% interest rate and everybody was willing to buy it. But if the government's debt gets harder to sell and they have to pay more in interest for it, so this is what's been happening over the past 2 months, that the bond market for U.S. Treasury yields is going up and up. And these higher prices for U.S. Treasury bonds basically raise interest rates throughout the economy. And you can see it most clearly in the mortgage market. So everything that you borrow is in a market for debt that people buy. And if the safest investment in that market becomes more expensive, everything else does too. That's what we're risking by having such an unsustainable fiscal path, that we don't get the maneuverability that Congress needs, and we all have to pay more to borrow, including for things like cars and mortgages and student loans and what have you. That is where the debt came from. It is everybody's fault. What we need now, and this is the actual, clear, simple solution to the U.S. national debt, is for there to be an adult in the room.